So a question that I've been thinking about a lot recently is exactly how many musical elements are there? And the funny thing is that no one seems to be able to agree. If you talk to 15 different musicians, you'll probably get 15 unidentical lists. However, most lists that you would find would include things like melody, harmony, rhythm, timbre, dynamics, and the list goes on. However, some of the lists that I have found have been more, let's say, conceptual. One musicologist listed concept, behavior, and sound as his list of elements. And to that point, it seems to matter whether or not you're talking to a performer or a musicologist. Go figure. Today, I'd like to do some theorizing of my own and try to come up with a definition of a musical element, and from there see if we can figure out exactly how many there are. For me, I need the definition of musical element to do two things. Number one, be concrete enough that we can confidently declare an aspect of music to meet that criteria. That fly is going to drive me nuts. I missed. And number two, not be so granular that it loses all practicality for our study of music. So we're going to go on a journey together today to test my hypothesis that there are three musical elements: rhythm, pitch, and timbre. But let's actually go on this journey first, and we'll see how that hypothesis holds up. Longtime viewers of the channel will know that I am a fan of chemistry. I was actually a chemistry major in undergrad for 2 years. But within chemistry, an element is a substance that cannot be broken down into other substances by chemical reaction. Cannot be broken down. Let's start there. Missed again, over 2. Melody is a very common thing to include in a list of musical elements. But what exactly is melody? A melody is a series of pitches that have some sort of rhythm. It takes place at a particular dynamic, and no matter what instrument it's played on, it has some form of timbre. So that would be a combination of pitch, rhythm, dynamics, and timbre. So if we're going with a definition of cannot be broken down any further, then melody's not an element of music, it's more like a musical compound. Same thing with harmony. You've got pitch, rhythm, and timbre, and you could even make an argument for texture as well. So you might be asking at this point, is this even a useful exercise? We all kind of just generally know what all of the elements of music are, and coming up with a definitive list doesn't really seem useful to me. And yeah, perhaps that's a reasonable stance for you to take. But as a music theorist, it's important because this prevents an argument about what is and isn't music based on whether or not a particular element is present. Our definitions of what an element is must be wide enough to include all things that are music. And I'll cover that in more detail here in a little bit. So as I was researching this section, I came across a presentation that was given at the Australian Society for Music Education conference. It's called The Elements of Music, What Are They and Why Should We Care? And yeah, that sounds exactly like what the point of this video is. The presentation is by Russell Burton, who I could not locate on the internet. So Russell, if you happen to be watching this, get in touch with me. I'd love to talk. It was a fascinating paper, and we tend to agree on a lot of the concepts that he talked about. But he's got a quote in there that I want to give now that lines up with the point that I was making earlier. Any list of the elements must hold true for a symphony, a snare drum solo, and John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds. These are vastly different. Our definition of a musical element must include all of those things. And it must also include genres that are commonly discredited as not being real music, like rap, pop, or country. So perhaps I need to ask a really philosophical question here. Does every element of music have to be present at all times? Do I have time to answer that question today? I don't know. I'll be popping in every so often to have a conversation with this paper, but if you would like to read the whole thing, I've got a link down in the description. So now let's examine my hypothesis a little bit closer. I said that I think there are three elements of music: pitch, rhythm, and timbre. So let's examine each of those individually. Pitch is the perceived highness or lowness of a particular sound. I say perceived because that's what sound actually is. It's a perception. Pressure waves that hit our ears in such a way that our brain perceives them as sounds. A lot of sounds that we would call musical have a periodic nature to them, and we might call this a tone. Not all sounds have tone, but all sounds have pitch. So yeah, I would say that pitch is definitely an element of music. Hey, fly's back. He's like sitting right behind the camera. You gonna go? We gonna go? got him. Next we have rhythm. Rhythm is the duration of a sound. And it really includes a successive component, so one sound after another. For me, I would consider all things that deal with time to be an aspect of rhythm. So that would be meter, tempo, duration of sound, and this is the controversial one, form. Some would make the argument that form is a separate component, but I really see form as sort of a long-term rhythm. And I definitely have to put an asterisk next to that one because I'm not sure that I can fully defend that in a rigorous sort of way. So let's circle back. All that being said, rhythm, I think we can safely say, is an element of music. Cannot be broken down into anything else. You might be like, well, why is time not the element of music? And I think time is just too granular. So rhythm is the element, not time. Then we have timbre. Timbre is the specific color of the sound. All sound has a particular timbre. This can also be looked at very scientifically, and quite frankly, I don't think that musicians have come up with an efficient and standardized way to talk about timbre, but it is an aspect of sound. Timbre definitely includes articulation as a sub-element of timbre. I think in my thinking up until now, I would have considered both texture and dynamics to be part of timbre, but I don't think that's a good thing to do. I'm reconsidering. So texture and dynamics might be their own thing, but timbre is definitely an element of music. I think these three things can be charted out pretty well on a coordinate plane. So we'd have pitch as the y-axis, moving up and down. We have rhythm as the x-axis, moving from left to right, because at least as of right now, time does not move backwards. And then timbre is color. If you have made it this far into the video, you are probably the kind of person who likes music theory, music composition, and musicology, and that's exactly what my email newsletter is all about. It's a weekly inside look into my work in these three fields, as well as exclusive and curated content. I highly recommend signing up. The link is down in the description. Now, what to do with dynamics? As I was charting this out, I realized dynamics has to do with volume or just overall energy, which up until now I've placed with timbre, but it's really not. It doesn't just affect the color, it's more of its own sort of z-axis. And for that, I think I'm going to have to consider dynamics an element on its own. And like I said, this doesn't just include loudness, but also just kind of overall energy as well. But it still operates on that sort of front to back level, which we can chart on our graph. Do that, editor. Speaking of three dimensions, what about space? Not outer space, but just sort of the spatial element of music. Music takes place in physical space. We have binaural hearing, which means that the space that music takes place in affects our perception of the music. There's no other category in which I feel like I could place space. And this seems to be a bit of a gray area, as this is the only thing that we've talked about so far that's not dictated by the score itself. That means this particular aspect would change from performance to performance as you change venue. This also would be impacted by like stereo imaging if we're talking about a recording, if we're listening to it in headphones. If you recorded a piece for solo piano in a really live reverberant concert hall, and then you recorded an identical performance in a much drier sort of recording studio, your ears would be able to tell the difference between the two, and it would profoundly change the feel of the music. So I feel like space has to be considered an element of music, and I also feel like we could do an entire separate video on just this topic alone. Which brings me to texture, which is like homophonic versus polyphonic. This is an interesting one for me because I most commonly associate texture with harmony. It's the texture that determines how the harmony is presented. So I guess the question is really, is texture a component of harmony, or is harmony a component of texture? The thing that complicates this even more is that I could see an argument that texture is a component of rhythm. In a homophonic texture, everyone has the same rhythm, but in a polyphonic texture, they don't. So that would put texture as a compound of both rhythm and pitch. And for that, I'm tempted to say that it's not an element of music, but I could be persuaded otherwise. So we'll put a pin in that for now. And finally, I want to talk about form and expression. A lot of lists include these as elements of music. And I've grouped them together because I kind of feel like they're a combination of all of the other elements. Maybe it's like how black is the presence of all other colors? Or is it white? I can't remember. Okay, so black is the presence of all colors if we're talking about pigment, and white is the presence of all colors if we're talking about light. That's not confusing at all. Point being, Form and expression are both the result of a composer taking all of the other elements of music and putting them together in a meaningful way. Music is an expression. Music has a structure. It has a form. So in a sense, these two are sort of like one level above all of the other elements that we've been talking about. So all sound has these properties. It is at some pitch, lasting some amount of time, at some loudness, in physical space, and containing some color. And my definition of music is that it is humanly organized sound. But then, by that definition, wouldn't speech also be considered music? It has pitch, rhythm, dynamics, timbre. It takes place in physical space and is organized by humans. There are a lot of musicologists who would just include the definition of sound in their list of musical elements. The paper by Burton lists those properties as pressure and time, which for me is too granular. That's like saying that a chemical element is like protons, neutrons, and electrons. Yes, all chemical elements are made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons, and that is technically correct, but it's not really helpful. So Burton argues for separating what he calls the elements of sound from the aspects of sound that are distinct to music, which he calls the elements of music. Let me try that out for you. He lists 6 elements of sound. Those are pitch, dynamics, rhythm, texture, timbre, and spatial location. And then he has 3 elements of music. So that would be aspects of sound that are distinct to music making. And those 3 are artistic intent, sound, and structure. So this is sort of a similar line of thinking to what I was saying earlier about form and expression being like one level above. There's another reason that I feel like this is a worthwhile endeavor. I wanted the definition of an element to be 1, concrete, but number 2, practical. And what coming up with a definitive list of elements does for us is that it gives us a framework for studying music theory that sort of decentralizes harmony. If music theory is going to be valuable and practical to all musicians and not just those musicians who play in a harmony-centric genre like jazz or classical, then we need a theoretical framework that is capable of handling that. If we were to break up the music theory curriculum by looking at how each individual element is used in the music creation process, it would give musicians of every style a better analytical framework for understanding how the particular music that they create is put together. So that would make this exercise not only valuable to educators for giving a structure to their curriculum, but it would also be valuable then to composers and performers of all musical styles. But now let's talk about where I disagree with him. So I wrote up this entire section where I listed all the ways that I disagreed with him, but then I kind of realized that I was splitting hairs, maybe even splitting atoms in some cases. So here, I'll summarize. What I would say is that the 6 elements of sound that he listed, I think, is a valid list. I kind of still disagree about texture, but I could see his argument. But the thing is the things that he listed as elements of music, I would really kind of see better as a definition of music, and the elements of sound that he listed, I would say that that's kind of exactly what all of us think about when we hear the term elements of music. This, for me, is the best way to be both concrete and practical. I think if I was to structure the theory curriculum around this, what I would do is I would start with the definition of music and include those 3 aspects, but then I would move into the elements of music and talk about each one of those individually as a unit. So that would give us a total of 5 elements of music, maybe 6. I am not ready to consider texture an element. I think it's a combination of rhythm and pitch, but I definitely see the argument for it. Perhaps, though, you still think that this is just a thought experiment, and that's okay. But I believe that this is a worthwhile endeavor for 2 reasons. Number 1, being wide enough to include all things that are music. And number 2, it gives us a better framework for teaching the critical aspects of all styles of music. Thanks for watching.